They had their own enterprise, a full operation with markets carved out, specific suppliers they trusted, and regular customers lined up. To a normal person, that sounds like the recipe of a booming business. But when you hear those same words coming from a judge during sentencing in a courtroom packed with tension, you know the story is very different. This was no ordinary businesswoman. These were the words of JKIA Chief Magistrate Justice Njeri Thuku as she delivered a verdict that will send shockwaves through Kenya's criminal underworld. Joyce Akinyi, a name that had long been whispered in the darkest corners of Nairobi, was finally facing justice. Joyce wasn't your typical street dealer hustling small bags on the corner. She built a sprawling empire worth hundreds of millions of shillings, with suspicious, tangled ties that reached all the way from the streets of Tanzania to the ports of India. A shadowy network that spanned borders and defied easy capture. For 5 grueling years, the courtroom drama unfolded. Witnesses, evidence, heated arguments, a legal battle that gripped the nation. And on this day, the scales of justice tipped. The judge's words echoed in the packed courtroom. 25 years behind bars and a fine of 9 million Kenyan shillings. Joyce Akinyi's reign had come to an end. But how exactly did a woman so powerful, so untouchable, fall this hard? What led Kenya's most notorious drag queen from the height of luxury to a prison cell? Before we plunge into this tangled story, I want to pause and say a massive thank you to every one of you, 24,000 subscribers strong. Your support fuels these stories and I don't take it for granted. Let's reach 50,000 subscribers before the end of the year. If you haven't already, make sure you hit that like button and drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one, I promise. Remember, it takes blood, sweat, threats, lawsuits, and lots of sleepless nights to create these videos for you guys. Please subscribe. This is Shadows of Justice. I am Mike Kahende and you are absolutely awesome. Joyce Akinyi was born in Maseno, a humble town nestled in western Kenya, where life possibility often felt limited but hopes remained high. Soon after her birth, her family joined the familiar migration of many Kenyan families, moving to Kikuyu in search of greener pastures and better opportunities. Her father was an engineer working at Kenya Post and Telecommunications, a respected position that promised some stability. The family's fortunes seemed to be improving, especially when they relocated to Karen, one of Nairobi's most prestigious neighborhoods. The move was a clear sign they were moving up in the world, a symbol of success and aspiration in a city where status is often measured by your address. Joyce's education began at St. Mary's Primary School, where she attended until class 3. But life took a sharp turn when her father was retrenched from his job. The security they once had vanished overnight. Forced to leave Karen, the family moved back to Juja Road, a much rougher neighborhood with fewer resources and harsher realities. Despite the upheaval, Joyce remained determined to succeed. She completed her primary education at Muslim Primary School and later joined Rangala Girls, a public school in Siaya County. However, Health complications forced yet another move, this time to St. Julian's High School, a private school still in Siaya, where she finally completed her secondary school at the young age of 17. After high school, Joyce faced a devastating blow, the death of her father in 1994. The loss left a void not just emotionally, but financially. With her father gone, her mother stepped up to hold the family together, but the burden was heavy. In an attempt to support the family, Joyce and her mother embarked on frequent trips to Uganda, close to their native Ugunja. There, they sourced ladies' wear and other goods to sell on the streets outside Nyayo House in Nairobi, a bustling area where street hawkers hustled for daily survival. When illness struck her mother, Joyce found herself making the trips alone, a young woman navigating foreign markets and rough city streets, driven by a fierce determination to keep her family afloat. With some savings accumulated, Joyce dared to dream bigger, enrolling in a Bachelor of Commerce program in India, hoping to elevate her prospects. But reality hit hard. The school fees were too high, especially with her mother also struggling to pay for her siblings' education back home. So she pivoted, turning to businesses in a different form, importing goods from India and selling them locally at a markup. The hustle was real, the stakes high. She was a young entrepreneur, striving to provide and make something of herself despite the odds stacked against her. But as with many Kenyan stories of ambition and struggle, tragedy wasn't far behind. The path Joyce chose would soon become more complicated, darker, a tale of survival, ambition, and eventually downfall. 2001, Nairobi. The city was fast, loud, and unforgiving, and especially for a 20-year-old with nothing but courage and the weight of her siblings on her shoulders. Just 2 years earlier, Joyce Akinyi had buried her mother. Before that, her father. Now, as the firstborn, she was the only thing standing between her family and the streets. With no academic certificates to get her through an interview and no relatives to lean on, she had to survive by instinct. The Nairobi she stepped into was a jungle, Kanairo as the streets called it, where the rich flaunted their power and the poor learned quickly or got eaten alive. Shielded only by her strict Christian upbringing, Joyce landed a menial job that barely paid enough but kept her away from the vultures circling young women in the city. But Nairobi had many faces, and the nightlife was one of its loudest. In search of something better, Joyce tried her luck in the city's entertainment scene, where music, flashing lights, and the scent of money mixed with the danger. Reports on the details are murky, but somewhere in those smoky clubs and high-end bars, fate introduced her to a man who would change her life forever. He was Tony Chinedu, young, sharp-dressed, and carrying himself with the confidence of a Nigerian prince. He spoke with the smooth assurance of a man who knew the streets and the boardrooms. To many, he was a businessman. To Joyce, he was a doorway to a different life, one that will be bigger, faster, and much riskier. If you saw them in 2005, you'd swear they were Nairobi's ultimate power couple. Tony Chinedu, sharp suits, a voice that commanded any room; Joyce Akinyi, elegance wrapped in quiet confidence. Together, they weren't just living comfortably, they were thriving. Two beautiful kids, born in July 2001 and April 2004. A wedding formalized at the Attorney General's chambers, followed by a short but stylish ceremony, and then the spending began, starting with 2 mansions in Jacaranda, homes plotted under their names. Another massive investment they made was the Deep West pub off Langata Road, which they renovated and reopened in December 2005, about 4 months after I had been born. A nightlife hotspot where music thumped, glasses clinked, and politicians rubbed shoulders with hustlers. They moved to a mansion in Lavington later that year and started to build another 8 townhouses in the same neighborhood, each valued at 18 million Kenya shillings. But behind the champagne toast and the extravagant city life, there was a question nobody asked too loudly. Where was all this money coming from? To the untrained eye, the Chinedus look like self-made success stories. To the authorities, they look like a goldmine of unanswered questions. By the mid-2000s, whispers had turned into dossiers. Investigators suspected that behind the pub's booming business was a far more lucrative enterprise, one that moved not drinks but heroin. By 2008, the Chinedu Akinyi love story had crumbled into something bitter, explosive. The lavish parties were gone. The smiles in photographs were replaced with court summons and sworn affidavits. Their marriage had turned acrimonious, with legal battles erupting over multi-million shilling properties and the custody of their 2 children. Accusations flew like snapple. Adultery, desertion, betrayal. Chinedu's court filings went as far as naming former Budalangi MP Raphael Wanjala, accusing him not only of pursuing his estranged wife, but also of grabbing property worth 300 million Kenya shillings. Wanjala denied everything at first. But then came the Stanley Hotel incident. One evening in Nairobi's CBD, Wanjala and Akinyi were spotted leaving the hotel together. NTV cameraman Mustafa Mwalimu Musa, who had been covering a separate scandal involving Wanjala, turned his lens toward them, snapping a photo that will ignite a storm. That single click seemed to light a fuse. What followed was chaos, a confrontation, an alleged assault on the journalist, and police involvement. Wanjala was charged with assault occasioning actual bodily harm, though he pleaded not guilty. And then, in a move nobody saw coming, Wanjala stood before a crowd at a rally in Port Victoria and publicly admitted his affair with Akinyi. He went as far as referring to her as his wife under customary law, defiantly asking the media to keep out of his private life. What he didn't know was that this scandal, as humiliating as it was, would be nothing compared to what was coming. Because while the headlines were busy with the love triangles and property disputes, a far more dangerous storm was already on its way. One that could ruin far more than just reputations. October 2008. What had started as whispers in Nairobi's backrooms suddenly exploded into the international stage. At New Delhi Indira Gandhi International Airport, Indian police arrested Raphael Wanjala, then a sitting member of parliament, and Joyce Akinyi. The charge was clear. They were allegedly part of a sophisticated money laundering ticket. When customs officers opened their bags, they found the equivalent of 7.5 million shillings in crisp US dollar notes. In India, the law is simple. Any amount above 375,000 shillings must be declared. They had declared nothing. It was the kind of haul that didn't just raise eyebrows, it set off sirens. At first, it seemed like a straightforward currency violation, but once the authorities tried to log Akinyi's travel documents into their prison database, the story took a darker turn. The details on her papers didn't match the records supplied by the Kenyan government. The uncomfortable truth began to surface. She was traveling under an alias. Investigators began retracing her steps. Their findings read like a smuggler's playbook. Akinyi and Wanjala had quietly left Kenya through Uganda, avoided direct scrutiny, flown into Dubai, and then boarded an Emirates flight into India. She was holding a passport that bore a completely different name. It was deception at a level suggested experience and confidence. The arrest made headlines across Kenya and India, and what followed was a legal nightmare. Bail was initially granted, but after further scrutiny, Indian authorities revoked it. The pair was sent to Tihar prison, a sprawling high-security facility infamous for housing some of India's most notorious criminals. For Akinyi, it was a far cry from the Deep West pub in Langata Road, where she once hosted Nairobi's well-heeled. They spent an entire month inside before the bail cancellation came through. Back home, the ripple effects were immediate. While Akinyi and Wanjala were battling the Indian justice system, her estranged husband, Tony Chinedu, saw an opportunity. With both adults locked up in foreign prison, he moved swiftly through the Kenyan courts, seeking full custody of their 2 children. His argument was calculated but effective. He told the court there was no one to look after the children, claiming they were being neglected and mistreated by the house help. He described a visit to their school, where he found them in poor physical and mental condition. His son withdrawn, seemingly depressed. He said they had been living alone with the house help for over a month. The court listened. In a decisive ruling, they awarded Chinedu full custody, but with a safeguard. He was to surrender his passport and the children's passports to prevent him from leaving the country. For Chinedu, it was a victory that allowed him to regain control over the children. For Akinyi, trapped thousands of kilometers away in Tihar, it was yet another crushing defeat. What had begun as a love affair turned business partnership had now spiraled into an international scandal, a public love triangle, and bitter custody war. And for the authorities, it was a confirmation that the Akinyi-Chinedu story was far from over. Joyce Akinyi and Raphael Wanjala would secure their release from India 6 months after their capture, primarily through the payment of bail. Their families managed to raise the required funds, about 1.6 million Kenyan shillings. The Kenyan High Commissioner in New Delhi also played a key role, facilitating legal assistance and arranging the bail. Reports also indicated that intervention from Kenyan authorities, including former Foreign Affairs Minister Raphael Tuju, helped secure their release. Eventually, the pair were cleared of the charges and the money they had carried was returned following a court order. Once back on Kenyan soil, Akinyi went straight to her estranged husband, Tony Chinedu's house, where she caused an overnight drama captured by cameras. She publicly blamed Chinedu for her troubles in India and accused him of leasing their Deep West property to a local investor without her consent. As tensions escalated, police officers from multiple units stormed the premises, conducting a raid in an apparent search for contraband. After a 2-hour sweep, they towed away 2 vehicles parked on the compound, claiming their registration numbers appeared suspicious. Barely 24 hours after returning to Kenya, Joyce Akinyi appeared at Deep West restaurant in Nairobi, publicly alleging that Tony Chinedu had forcefully taken over the club in violation of a standing court injunction. The accusations quickly escalated into a highly publicized confrontation, drawing crowds and cameras as the two clashed. Police were eventually forced to intervene, and Chinedu was physically removed from the premises. Ironically, Chinedu had been willingly to share the property, but Akinyi refused, turning what could have been a negotiated settlement into yet another public spectacle.
Deep West restaurant turned into a battlefield. The battlefield of Akinyi and Chinedu. They have been at it over a year now. Yet the further they try to get from each other, the closer they come. And today was more of the same as Anthony Chinedu and Joyce Akinyi came face to face. The estranged couple is fighting over control of the matrimonial property, the Deep West resort being just one of them.
I came back to claim back my property. He has been given protection with police, and police are here to protect him.
She can't allow me to talk, so how can I answer you?
Akinyi and her partner, Raphael Wanjala, the former Budalangi MP, were released over the weekend from an Indian jail, where they had spent nearly 6 months after they were found traveling with an equivalent of nearly 8 million Kenyan shillings in cash, which is against the Indian law. And so, when she arrived back in Kenya yesterday, Akinyi reportedly ordered the Deep West resort closed, ostensibly because Chinedu had forcibly taken control over the business, which she claimed was against a court order. And this is what led to today's skirmishes. And with matters appearing to get out of hand, Chinedu finally decided to leave the facility, perhaps to re-strategize. And the police were at hand to escort him. But not before he gave us his side of the story.
Everything has solution, but the solution is not through violence, or through mugging people, or through harassment or intimidation. Everything has solution.
So are you ready to share property in the house?
Very, very much. That is what is my aim. That is what I want.
Months later, Akinyi, now in full custody of the 12 children, returned to court accusing Chinedu of failing to provide for their basic necessities. Chinedu responded that he had been denied access to his children, but remained willing to support them financially. The court ordered him to deposit 70,000 shillings into Akinyi's bank account before the 5th day of every month. But Akinyi later claimed that the payments were inconsistent or had not been made at all. What had begun as a family dispute now fully evolved into bitter public feud, played out across courts, police stations, and media headlines. But this kind of attention, it was terrible for business. The club drama, the headlines, the cameras, Joyce and Chinedu weren't just beefing with each other anymore. Now, the authorities were watching. In fact, this wasn't even the first time someone had tried to get Chinedu out of Kenya. There had been early attempts to deport him over narcotic suspicion, but they all fell apart. The police couldn't make anything stick until April 13, 2013. That afternoon, Chinedu was chilling inside his Kilelesho home when the anti-narcotics unit showed up unannounced. They tore through the place and allegedly found 10 grams of a substance they claimed was heroin, plus some equipment they said was used in making drugs. Chinedu immediately denied everything. He told reporters that this was all a setup, that Joyce was trying to get revenge, and that she had sent a man to his house that day to make it happen. But this time, the detectives weren't letting go. By now, the Nairobi underworld was already in chaos. A tough war over Kenya's drug trade had gotten so violent that bodies were dropping, rival gangs were snitching, and police were hitting stash houses left and right. Every arrest, every seizure was a power shift, and in one of those separate police operations, 2 men were picked up. One of them, a Nigerian said to be connected to Chinedu's close associate, Fatai Cartel. One guy was caught with 268 grams of heroin. The Nigerian had 20. It wasn't hard to see how the net was tightening. For Joyce Akinyi, this was almost poetic. 10 days later, April 23rd, Chinedu walked out of jail on a 200,000 Kenya shillings bond. As he danced out of the courtroom, he might have thought he was in the clear, but in reality, that was the first step in what will turn into a slow, very public, and very dramatic downfall. 2013 was a big year for Kenya. It was an election year, and after Uhuru Kenyatta was sworn in as the president, one of the loudest promises from his administration was a crackdown on the drug trade, especially when it came to foreigners. For Chinedu, that was either the unluckiest timing imaginable or the final nail in his coffin. Barely weeks after walking out of jail, Chinedu was back on the radar. On June 3, 2013, a sting operation unfolded in Nairobi. This wasn't your average police bust. Officers from the Special Crime Prevention Unit, the Flying Squad, and immigration officials were all involved. They hit Chinedu's Lavington home hard, arrested him, and drove him straight to JKRA police station. But he wasn't alone. 10 other foreigners were also lined up, all marked for deportation. Hours later, they were marched onto an international airline and sent straight back to Nigeria. It looked like the Kenyan government had finally washed their hands off him. Except that's not how the story went. When the plane landed in Nigeria, it didn't just unload its passengers and head home. The Nigerian government grounded it. 5 crew members were detained, and suddenly this was no longer just a deportation. It was an international incident. Chinedu never wanted to keep quiet, took the opportunity to taunt the Kenyan government. He claimed he was using his connection in Nigeria to keep the plane as compensation for the properties he said had been taken from him in Kenya. This statement was bold, but not everyone was buying it. Joyce Akinyi broke her silence. She publicly dismissed Chinedu's claims, saying he owned nothing in Kenya and calling him an opportunist. She even went further, exposing some of his alleged underworld dealings. What she didn't know at the time was that her own reckoning was coming and her punishment would be far worse than Chinedu.
Unajua mtu kama Chinedu ni mtu wa kujionyesha. So alianza vile alijionyesha na wakaanza kumfuata na wakamjua kama walimtimua, wako na reason zao za kumtimua. Though mimi niko na reason zangu za kusema yeye ni mhalifu, because I know, ninajua Ile kitu najua ninajua. Kama kutuma wasichana, wambebe drugs, wanabeba, wanamletea pesa, vitu kama hizo, hata maivory hizi za elephants. Pia akona hiyo kateli yao watu, wanawauzia hivyo vitu. Metoka country yao akiwa 14 years. Na babake is just an ordinary businessman. Anaweza kuwa na influence gani? Na hakuwahi rudi huko. Anarudi tu hiyo kidogo kidogo ya December anarudi. So kama hata anaweza kuwa na influence yoyote kule, maybe people know him as somebody who has a lot of money, but not that is connected to the government. Hiyo, unless government ya Kenya and a portion of Kenyan government.
By late June, the tension around the deportation was winding down. Nigerian authorities eventually cited lapses in procedure as the reason for detaining the crew. On June 28, 2013, 3 weeks after the drama began, they were released and the incident faded from headlines. By November 2013, the headlines had moved on from the Deep West brawl, but Joyce Akinyi's name hadn't lost its shine or its notoriety. That month, she had former MP Frederick Wanjala found themselves right back in the spotlight, and again for all the wrong reasons. It started on a quad stretch off-road in Siaya. Police officers flagged down a vehicle coming in from the Tanzania border. Inside, 5 people: Akinyi, Wanjala, and 3 others. In the boot sat 2 heavy bales wrapped in cloth. When the officers cut them open, a fine white powder spilled out. To the police, it looked like the kind of find that could end careers and make headlines. To Akinyi, it was just maize flour. That was the story she stuck to. Their lawyer, Cliff Ombeta, stepped in fast. He spun the narrative. There was a looming maize shortage in Kenya, and his clients were simply forward thinkers who had gone to Tanzania to get samples in preparation for a big shipment. It was a stretch, but somehow it worked. Within 24 hours, Wanjala was free, and after medical scans showed Akinyi and the others hadn't swallowed any narcotics, they were released too. For the public, it was just another Joyce Akinyi close call, but for the authorities, it was proof of something they already believed. This woman was playing a dangerous game, and they just needed to wait for her to make one wrong move. They wouldn't have to wait long. By 2015, Akinyi was still operating, but she'd gone quieter. Less public drama, fewer headlines. She knew eyes were on her. But the thing about running illegal operations is one mistake can undo years of careful moves, and on March 25, 2015, she made that mistake. It started with a man named Alex Otieno. Detectives in Langata picked him up after a tip of suggestion he was moving drugs. When they searched him, they didn't just find the goods, they found a link. Under questioning, Otieno led officers to another house. Inside was a bag filled with a white substance. To the naked eye, it looked like the same kind of maize flour Akinyi had been caught with in 2013, but the detectives knew better. The house was tied to a man named Kelvin Odor, but interestingly, the rent was being paid by a woman named Rispa Auma. That was enough to dig deeper. When they questioned Odor, another piece of the puzzle fell into place. He admitted that Auma had recently called him, asking him to make sure the package was delivered to Deep West Club. The instructions were clear: no delays. Meanwhile, Otieno, still in custody, kept getting calls from the same number. The detectives asked him who it was. His answer made everything click. It was Joyce Akinyi. She was growing impatient, demanding to know why the delivery was taking so long. The detectives saw their opening. They told Otieno to go ahead with the drop, only this time they'd be watching. That evening, Otieno walked into Deep West Club like it was just another delivery day. Akinyi was there, calm, collected, like she'd done this 100 times before. The handoff was smooth, no words, no fuss, but the moment the package touched her hands, undercover officers closed in. They didn't just find the delivery package. When they searched her handbag, they uncovered another parcel, carefully wrapped in black and white polythene. The message was clear: this wasn't some casual mistake. For years, Joyce Akinyi had played a dangerous balancing act, slipping through legal loopholes, spinning stories and walking free while the police seethed. But this time, it felt different. The noose was tightening and her luck was starting to run out. By the end of 2015, Joyce Akinyi had somehow managed to slither out of yet another case. Nobody really knows how. Maybe it was luck, maybe it was connections, or maybe it was just the chaos of Kenya's justice system. But one thing was clear, she was back on the streets and moving differently. Instead of laying low like most people would after dodging that kind of heat, Akinyi doubled down. She started moving serious money through the banks, the kind of transactions that made her look less like a struggling club owner and more like someone who was quietly operating on another level. In 2015, she opened not one but two accounts at Stanbic Bank, and the numbers were insane. On November 10th, she dropped a casual 20 million shillings into one of those accounts, then pulled out 7.7 million within just 10 days. Like, who does that? That's not business as usual. That's the type of money that screams red flag to financial investigators. And it didn't stop there. In her second account, she deposited nearly 50 million Kenyan shillings over the course of just 3 days, from January 2015 to September 2018. The money kept rolling in. By this point, Joyce wasn't just living comfortably. She was living like a full-blown millionaire, and you could see it in how she carried herself. Her lifestyle screamed untouchable, but that feeling of being invincible, it was a trap. Because while she thought the money and influence made her bulletproof, the truth was the opposite. Every big move she made only made her a bigger target. And then, in classic Akinyi fashion, she pushed it too far. At her Deep West club in Nairobi West, the same place that had become both her business front and her alleged distribution hub, Joyce was arrested again on July 2019. This time, it wasn't just whispers or suspicion. Detectives from the DCI's Special Crimes Prevention Unit, working with the Anti-Narcotics Department, went undercover as customers. The prosecution meticulously laid out the case. 12 witnesses took the stand, each adding another piece to a puzzle that painted a damning picture. They weren't just saying Joyce and her crew were running drugs locally. No, this was bigger. Detectives linked them to a sophisticated transnational drug trafficking network. Suddenly, it was just another Deep West. It was about something far more global. But even as the evidence stacked higher, not everyone was willing to stick around for the verdict. Piers Anyango Omondi, one of Joyce's closest allies in the scheme, vanished before the trial ended. She straight up absconded, disappearing from the radar, leaving her fate hanging in the balance. Finally, after years of courtroom battles, appeals, and adjournments, the hammer came down. The sentencing was delivered in Court Number 1 at Jomo Kenyatta International Airport, presided over by Honorable Jerry Thuku. Joyce Akinyi, once the flamboyant Nairobi socialite and club owner, was convicted on narcotics trafficking charges. Her punishment? Brutal. 25 years behind bars and a massive fine of 9 million shillings. Her co-accused, Kalala, wasn't spared either. Even though he had already spent years rotting in remand, the court sentenced him to 10 more years in prison, plus the same crushing financial penalty. And as for Piers Anyango Omondi, the woman who thought she could outsmart justice by disappearing, she was sentenced in absentia to 25 years as well. A warrant was immediately issued for her arrest, her punishment waiting for her the second she slipped up. For Joyce, this wasn't just another case she could wiggle out. This was the endgame, the fall of a woman who once believed she was untouchable. In the end, Joyce Akinyi's downfall wasn't just about drugs, money, or flashy cars. It was about choices. Choices that caught up with her in the most brutal way. Back in 2013, when her marriage to Chinedu crumbled, she was the one who turned on him. She painted him as the villain, dragged him through court, and in many ways handed him over to authorities. Chinedu's empire collapsed and his fate was sealed. He became the cautionary tale of Nairobi's underworld, a man destroyed by the very game he tried to run. Ironically, Chinedu will later be awarded 70% of the property they were disputing with Akinyi. But here's the cruel twist. A decade later, Joyce found herself walking the exact same path. The very move that once gave her the upper hand, snitching on her husband, didn't save her when her own sins came knocking. Instead, she ended up in the same cage she thought she had avoided, serving a 25-year sentence while stripped of the luxury and power she once flaunted. The irony couldn't be louder. Joyce betrayed her husband to survive, but in the end, she suffered an almost identical fate, proving that in the world of crime, no one really gets away. For Nairobi, the story of Joyce Akinyi became more than just a headline. It was the rise and fall of a woman who thought she was untouchable. A reminder that the higher you climb in the shadows, the harder the crash when the lights finally hit. Nairobi Insight.